Hello, everyone. Back with Patty Reed's doll, Chapter 5, Out on the Prairie. Those first few days out on the prairie after crossing the Missouri River were like one long picnic. The grassy meadow stretched away and away with no sign of houses or town or even trees. Excuse my cat. Only blue sky coming down to meet green plains, and oh, the flowers. It's like a big garden, Grandma, said Patty, lifting the wagon flap to look out. May I get down and pick a bouquet, Mother? If you will stay close by, you may. Take the boys with you. They need to stretch their legs a bit, her mother said. The dogs came bounding up to greet us and followed us into the fields. Frances and Leanna Donner jumped out of their wagon to join us, too, and the three little girls began busily filling their aprons with flowers. The pink ones are verbena, Leanna told the other two. Mother knows the names of all of them. We must take some to her for her scrapbook. What are the blue ones that look like bean blossoms? Patty held up one that she had just picked. Wild indigo, I think Mother called them. Some of the blue ones are larkspur. Mrs. Donner lifted 4-year-old Georgia and 3-year-old Eliza down from the high wagon, and they came running over to trail along behind us with Tommy and Jimmy. The bluebells are blue, too, Leanna, 6-year-old Frances, knew the names of the flowers her mother had taught them, almost as well as did her 12-year-old sister. That's right, Frances, and here are some wild geraniums, Leanna answered. My mother says that your mother is going to have a school when we get to California. Maybe I can go to it. Papa is bringing a big box of books, too. He says books will be hard to get in California. Patty imparted this information as she stopped to weave blossoms in Leanna's blonde braids. I wonder if I could make a flower garland for Dolly. Patty took me out of her pocket and tried a bluebell on my head for size. Those tiny red flowers that grow close to the ground would make a cunning wreath for your Dolly, Leanna suggested. We had been having such a good time in those sweet-smelling fields of flowers that we hadn't noticed that a dark cloud had begun to cover the sun until Mrs. Reed and Mrs. Donner both called to the children to hurry back before the rain came down. Soon the sky was completely black and large raindrops had begun to fall. Brilliant streaks of lightning flashed and thunder followed them. Puss and her father came galloping back to the wagon. Puss dismounted to ride with us while it rained, and Mr. Reed tied Billy's halter to a stake at the tail of the wagon. Mrs. Reed got out his oilskin coat, and he rode on ahead. And how it poured, beating hard on the canvas wagon top and running down the sides in great streams. I hope it stops before supper time, Puss remarked. The evenings are so dreary when we can't have a campfire. These prairie thunderstorms do rise up of a sudden, said Grandma, but then they let up that quick too. And she was right. The storm was over soon and came out the sun. Oh, look at the rainbow, Patty exclaimed, raising the wagon flap to see what the wet world outside was like. It's so clear and bright I can almost reach out and touch it. Red, yellow, and Irish green. The king can't touch it, no more can the queen, recited Grandma. That's what my grandmother used to say when we saw the rainbow curving over the Kentucky hills. And I reckon her grandmother told it to her back in the old country where they had kings and queens. And I shall remember to say it when I'm a grandma too, said Patty, as I tried to think of little pink-cheeked Patty grown old and wrinkled like Grandma. In a way, though, I fancied they were quite alike. Grandma's bright black eyes were so like Patty's when they sparkled. You shall have many an exciting tale to store up for your grandchildren by the time this jaunt is over. For about a week the oxen plodded along, sometimes bogging down in the deep, muddy ruts left by the wagons up ahead. Grandma worked on her patchwork when the going wasn't too rough. Mrs. Reed sat on the comfortable spring seat knitting, while Patty tried to amuse Jimmy and Tommy, who were restless on wet days when they couldn't get out and run. The cows and little calves at the back of the train kept up a constant mooing and bawling. They got tired of being driven along all day. Occasionally, the dogs barked at them to keep them from wandering, and sometimes Mr. Reed had to go back to help the men drive them along. At night, in spite of all they could do to keep them corralled, as I heard them say, some of the cattle wandered, and Milton Bayliss and the other men had to ride out and round them up before breakfast. If they were tied, they got so tangled in the ropes that they would throw themselves before morning. They weren't enjoying this pioneering adventure as much as we were. One afternoon, Puss came galloping back to tell us that we were almost to the Kansas River, where we would have to be ferried across. Father rode ahead this morning to make arrangements with the ferryman. I heard him tell Uncle George Donner that they were Indians. Indians? Exclaimed Grandma. Mercy, they may scalp us all. They must be safe, or Father wouldn't let them take us. Mrs. Reed tried to sound reassuring, but looked apprehensive in spite of herself. Oh, they're tame Indians, I guess, Puss said. Father says they have already carried a large wagon train over ahead of us. That must be Colonel Russell's company. Did Father say we'd overtake them today? Mrs. Reed asked her. They are 3 miles ahead of us, the ferryman told him, camped at Soldier's Creek. Father thinks we'll come up with them before night. We had been traveling through the thick woods for the last few miles. The underbrush crackled beneath the wagon wheels, and the branches of the trees scraped against the canvas wagon top. Finally, we came out close to a boat landing on the bank of the Kansas River. The men were already driving the cattle into the river to make them swim across, and Milton Bayliss began unyoking the oxen so they could follow. 2 ferry boats were moored at the landing, and Mr. Reed and Uncle George and Uncle Jacob Donner were trying to reach an agreement with the Indians about the price. $1 per wagon they had charged the other party, they said. We watched with great interest as the men lifted each wagon onto the ferry boats, 2 wagons on each boat. When our turn came, we sat very still as they hoisted us up in midair and set us carefully down in the wobbly boat. Patty held up the wagon flap so we could see what was going on, while her mother held Tommy and Jimmy by her side to keep them from tumbling head first out into the river in their curiosity to see everything, especially the Indians. They were all eyes and full of questions as usual. If they drop us, will we break? Jimmy asked. They won't drop us, dear. They are very strong and careful, his mother said. Those men don't look like Indians, Mama. Where are their feathers? Jimmy persisted. Tame Indians don't wear feathers. Only wild ones do, Patty informed him. The wheels of our wagon were locked with chains and tied securely to the side of the boats. It wouldn't do to roll while we were in midstream. The ferrymen pushed the boats across with long poles, and as we watched their strong, rhythmical movements, we decided they must be very good Indians to help us like this. Perhaps all the fierce, unfriendly Indians were gone since Grandma was a girl. While the rest of the wagons were being ferried across, Patty's mother let her and the boys get out and stretch their legs. They found that the banks were covered with wild strawberries, and they set about filling the bucket Eliza handed them. We'll have strawberries and cream for supper tonight, Dolly, Patty said to me. Don't you wish you could open your tiny mouth and taste one? See how shiny and red they are? I could not tell her, but I think she knew I lived on love, not mortal food. And that was the end of chapter 5. Here is the last picture. And check back tomorrow, or I guess Monday, and we will be reading chapter 6, Colonel Russell's Company. See you then. Bye.